When we look at domains of life, domain is another category. I told you we put everything into categories, right? So when we look at domains of life, what I want to think about is what we actually mean by domain. So a domain we start to think about because life on Earth is very complex. There is huge diversity, okay? To date, we've identified about 1.8 million different species on this planet. And I can guarantee you there are probably at least twice that, if not more. The actual estimates put it into 10 to 100 million different species on this planet. Right now, today. So all of this diversity we have to start kind of putting together in some way to make sense out of it. So taxonomy actually looks at naming species. So to give them a name, give them a characteristic, give them some sort of sense of structure to the organization. Now keep in mind that much of this structure and organization is very human induced, right? We put things into these categories, but what we'll look at is how those categories actually make a lot of sense. So we have 3 domains: bacteria, archaea, and eukaryotes. I mentioned prokaryote to you before. Prokaryote were bacteria, right? Well, it turns out prokaryotes also are known as archaea. And the difference between these two, bacteria are the most widespread and most diverse by far of any organism on this planet, or any group of organisms on this planet. We will find them absolutely anywhere. At any given moment, you have more bacterial cells on you and in you than human cells. And many estimates put it that you have more bacteria in you and on you than the number of people that have ever been on this planet. Those are huge numbers, right? So when we look at these, we'll look at their important role. Now, yes, some of them make us sick, right? You get bacterial infections, but we'll look more importantly at the good things that they do and how they actually help us in our daily lives. Archaea are also prokaryotes. The difference between basic archaea and bacteria is that archaea are something we refer to as extremophiles. So phile means to like something. Okay? So in this case, they like the extremes. Okay? In particular, they like extreme environments. So high or low pH, high or low temperature, pressures, radiation, all of these things, we can find very interesting organisms that fall into this category. Now, they're going to be very similar to bacteria, but because of their likeness for these extreme environments, we'll also find some very fun characteristics associated with archaea as well. Eukaryotes you're more familiar with. We talked about these before when I showed you a eukaryotic cell. Eukaryotes, remember, have a nucleus. Have a nucleus. They have organelles. We talked about them. Their cells as being a little larger, a little more complex. The organisms themselves, well, I have some here for you. Some you might recognize. And we'll look at others as we go along. But you see this domain at the top is broken down then into kingdoms. So we have kingdom Plantae, so those are the plants. Kingdom Fungi with the fungus, and kingdom Animalia with the animals. So domain is the highest level. Then we break that down into kingdoms. Then we'll break that down into phylum, and we'll go from there. So we'll keep breaking down these categories into smaller and smaller and smaller chunks as we go. meaning that those chunks that we're breaking this into become more and more similar. Because if we actually just looked at the domain eukarya all day long, we would constantly be comparing you to a plant and to a fungus and to a sloth. Now, you have some things in common with all of those, but you're not super similar to any of them. So we'll look at that. We also have to look at how, as I mentioned to you, this common theme of evolution keeps coming back. And in particular, we've used fossils to start looking at how distant organisms are very similar to today's organisms. So when we look over billions of years, we estimate that the Earth is 4.6 billion years old. When we look at those kinds of ages, we have to start thinking about how fossils might help us tell a story about our planet. We'll look at things like different interactions, different community structures, how diversity and kinship play a very important role in evolution. So kinship is your relationship with your family, right? Who you're related to. But then we also look at, even though you're related, how are you different? And I'm not just talking hair color and eye color, but really, truly, how are you different at the genetic level? And we'll look at that. I mentioned to you that natural selection was going to be an important theme for us as part of evolution. So natural selection is tied to evolution, looking at the idea that populations are going to vary, individuals will be different, and we also have to look at the fact that some populations will produce far more offspring or children than other populations. Why is this so important? Well, when we talk about natural selection, we're going to talk about something known as adaptation. And when we talk about adaptation, I'm not just talking about you can put on a coat because you're cold. When we're talking about adaptation, what I want to look at is how organisms survive in the environment and why some of them survive better than others. So if I look at my beetles here, why is it that the bird picks out this light-colored beetle so quickly? Well, it's on a dark background, right? So the bird is looking for the first thing it sees, and it's easier for it to pick out these lighter colored beetles. So over time, what you see is these light colored beetles disappear from the population. So you're going to lose light beetles in this case. Now, how would this be different if the background was white? Sure, you'd lose all of the dark beetles first. Now, we have to think about what that means for a population over time. So this is something known as natural selection. You are selecting for an organism that is fit. When we talk about fitness, we're talking about ability to survive and reproduce. These beetles survived the bird eating, and they reproduced at very high levels. They are the most fit for this particular environment. We'll look at all of this. Don't feel overwhelmed. We're coming back to so many of these things. I'm just trying to give you a big sense of what's going on in biology and why we're going to go in the directions that we do to talk about things. Evolutionary adaptation lets us get things like the pangolin and killer whales. What's favorable in those organisms? What's selected for over time? Why are they so special? Why are they so important in ecosystems and in our planet? We'll look at natural selection as being strictly an editing mechanism. So it's selecting for the fit organisms. And if we talk about organisms being fit as the ones that survive and reproduce, natural selection is guiding evolution, guiding these changes in populations over time. Are we different today as a human population than we were 500 years ago? You betcha. We're taller. We're also a little fatter, but we're taller. Some will argue that we're smarter. Some will argue that we're not. But what's going on with this over time? And we can think about these things in biology. But we have to have a good way to go about testing things. We have to have a good way to go about thinking about biology as a science.